These are a couple of slides that are in your notes already. I wanted to try, before we finish the chapter, I wanted to try going back a little bit into, if you remember, before your essays were due. And that probably seems like an eternity ago. Before your essays were due, we read that chapter about language, and that began with the idea of classification. And I think I was inspired to do this because Gabe asked a question which I think he said was too big for anthropology, and I agreed. But Gabe, what do you wanted to know about?
I was just wondering why, people like to categorize everything around them.
Why people like to categorize everything around them. Yeah, I don't know why that is, but it does seem to be, doesn't it? It seems pretty widespread. There are some individuals who are less inclined to do this, and there are probably some societies that don't care as much, but people seem to be classifiers and categorizers. Our brains seem to be overbuilt for overthinking things, you might say. We're always as I discussed in the language thing, it seems like our languages are more complicated than they need to be to run our lives. So why should that be? Well, if they're more complicated than they need to be, there may not be a why. It may be one of those things that in the evolutionary people, some people have started using the term exaptations, something that was once adapted for a certain situation, but then becomes differently adapted in another situation which it had no intention of being used for. So, I mean, the deep why in this, the deep question of why, I'm not sure we can answer, but we can be pretty sure that this is something that humans do a lot of. And, it's not an inherently awful thing to categorize and classify, and we probably need to do it to live our lives. We need to be continually generating classifications so we can make meaning of our lives. We just want to be careful that we don't fall into things of thinking that our classifications are the only ones in the world, right? That's ethnocentrism, or that other people's are bad, or that they don't know what they're doing, because that's when things get into trouble. And this is kind of the same thing with social relations, right? I mean, we have all these complexities and ways that we think about the world and classify people and classify the world. And that's, again, not necessarily a bad thing to be thinking about how people are the same or different from each other. We just have to watch out when it becomes a source of inequality. I mean, there's the world, the world, life is the constant generation of difference. And so we can celebrate that. We just don't want to turn it into oppression and inequality. So in some ways, what I'm hoping to do here is link up what we were talking about with language and classification to this chapter on our complexity, our complex social relations, because there was no natural break in the textbook between these chapters. There just happened to be that time that I said, hey, we're at the end of this part one, time to write an essay. But these things are actually connected to each other. So in the last class, we went slower than I was anticipating, and then we ended up here with ideas about endogamy and exogamy. So who you can and can't marry, or who you're encouraged to marry. So most people are encouraged to marry outside of a certain set of kin. Right? We talked about the incest taboo, and you're encouraged to marry sometimes outside of a certain group. All human groups have been exogamous to a certain extent, but you're also often taught to not marry too far away, right? Maybe somebody who's the same religion or the same the same race, let's be blunt, in this country. So, you know, we have these ideas about marrying within your group or with your kind of people or with someone who would be a good fit. And, you know, every society has ideas about how far in and how far out a person should marry. And they do this a lot. And we talked about this is perhaps the third time that we've talked about, well, how is it that we have this idea of free love, free choice, I'm just doing my thing, and yet we end up, at least statistically, with so many people marrying each other of the same social class, and rarely do we encounter marriages across social classes. So we talked about simple proximity measures, like where you own your house, and also the educational system, which stands in to help organize ourselves when we're forming those romantic attachments. And so it reminded me of something we talked about at the very beginning of this chapter and what the authors begin with, which is, again, the idea of social class. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, you know, that the classes were dividing into the people who owned the means of production and the people who had nothing to sell but their own labor power, the proletariat. And, you know, I told you that they wrote the Communist Manifesto as kind of the meme to encourage revolution. So we should be careful about necessarily taking all of our social analysis or saying, Marx was wrong. You know, he didn't necessarily mean for that to be the ending of his political analysis. And later on, he would write about the return of Louis Bonaparte, which is to say, this was you may know Napoleon I in France, but Napoleon, he became called Napoleon III. He was like the nephew of Napoleon. And so, you know, France has this election, and basically he rises to the top of the electoral field out of name recognition, you might say, and goes on to be the ruler of France for more than 20 years here in mid-century. And so this was Marx reflecting on, wait a second, here we were in a revolution, we were on the barricades, I was writing this great thing, and now I'm under, or, you know, France is under basically the dictatorship of Napoleon III. Like, what happened? How was it that we went from being in a revolutionary situation to being in this situation where I'm having to sit back in exile and write this stuff? And so it's a much more reflective piece on, well, what does actually motivate human beings? Now, what's also interesting about this is that if you look at today's world, and our authors mention this back on page 120. For example, in America in the last few years, the rich have become richer while the economic situation of ordinary Americans has stagnated, which is true in the United States. They could have also said in Europe as well, not to the same extremes, but it's happened there as well. It basically has happened around the world. And we talked about how the rich have insulated themselves on islands in space and yachts. And there's a big expose going around the press right now about offshore finances and where they've stashed all this money away from tax collectors and regulation. And so in some objective way, if you measured the wealth inequalities of where we are now as compared to where we were when Marx and Engels were writing their stuff, it seems that in some ways we're dividing into something like you might call the bourgeoisie and the proletariat again. Now, in between, there are these ideas of the middle class and you know, these other classes that were involved, and those are important things, and obviously they haven't gone away. Here we are. We're all trying to be part of the middle class right here at Hartwick College. We're not dead yet. So, but objectively, there does seem to be this greater separation. Now, this is all adding up to this. If Marx were writing today, if we were looking at this situation, who would Napoleon III be? Who would he be sitting back and thinking, huh, how did this one happen? How did we go from here to there? Who's our equivalent of Napoleon III? The president. Yeah, the former president. I mean, I think that it's, and around the world, we might look at various people who have risen to the top and taken control of their countries through basically ethnic nationalism. And so we might wonder how it was that we went from these ideas of being all progressive and being globalization and tolerance and these things to the situation in which we are now. So certainly if Marx were writing today, it would be something of the second, oh Lord, what if it's 2024? The second term of Donald Trump. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we did not talk about class and caste in the last class. This is basically on page 120, where our textbook talks to us about caste. Many of you were fascinated with caste. If you're fascinated with caste, I would recommend going to the thing on Thursday about the political documentary at 4 o'clock in Jaeger 328, or taking one of Professor Sugandi's classes on peoples and cultures of South Asia, or probably any of her classes where she's going to talk about this more than I want to talk about it today. And the reason I'm going to be shy about talking about caste is I always get very suspicious of people from the outside talking about caste in India. And the reason I get suspicious is this. The very word caste actually comes to us from a Portuguese term, casta, which meant chaste, which is kind of a strange thing to think. So the Portuguese were doing their explorations of the world, and they set up several places to trade in India. And their idea was that Indian society was based on this thing that they called caste. So it's not actually a word that comes to us from India. It's already an observation of the Portuguese who are trying to make sense of this in their own Portuguese way. And so it also, as your book does tell us, it probably took on a more significant role under colonial rule. We had 300 years of British colonialism in India. And, you know, the Brits love to classify and organize people. And this was a very good way to do it. So I think one of the reasons I get nervous about our own notions of caste coming from our society is that that caste was not necessarily something that endured for thousands of years in India. I mean, it's definitely very traditional. It goes back a long time, but it got interpreted differently and then revved up and used quite a bit differently under colonialism. So that said, let's talk about the difference between being in a social class and being in a caste. If we are in a social class in this country, what is a social class based upon? When I say we have social class endogamy, that we marry someone from our own social class, what am I talking about? What do we base social class on? Yeah, Aaron. A lot of times people base it on your income. Absolutely. And in fact, because we only collect statistics on income, remember, if you have wealth, you're trying to put it offshore or something and get it out of the tax collectors. We usually do classify people based upon their income measures because that's what we have from the tax returns. And if your class is usually at least classified based on your income, what are we trying to do here at Hartwick College? Why are we here? I know, we're here just to learn about anthropology. What's the goal? Why are we flight pathing you all? Where are you taking off to? Gabe. A higher social class. We want class mobility, or at least to be able to stay where we are in this country, man. If you don't go to college, you might not even stay where you are. You have to get there just to stay where you are. So there's lots of debate about how class is defined. And some people that look poor according to their income might be from some sort of super wealthy class. And so they might, you know, if you just measured their income, you'd say, oh, they're down the class. But in fact, their parents or grandparents might be so wealthy that they're effectively of the upper class. So when we usually talk about class, it has something to do with either our income. I personally like to do wealth. It's hard to measure wealth in this country because, like I said, if you have wealth, you're trying to hide it and keep it away from other people. But it's some sort of economic thing. And to some degree, you're supposed to be able to move up or move down. You're not supposed to be permanently encased in your social class. All right, so what's caste then? Like, what differentiates caste? What is caste supposed to be? Leah, what would you say? I know this was so long ago. It's like 3 dudecks ago that you talked about this, but what would you say caste is supposed to be in contrast to class?
Caste is very rigid. Class is more flexible. Caste, and at least the system I was talking about, which in India, they were very rigid. You couldn't really marry out of your social class. It was like you could marry just barely at the bottom of another one, just barely at the top of the other. It was just, and they said they like got rid of it, but it's still very almost important in society still, even though it's not written down, I guess, anymore. It's so important.
Right. So caste, in contrast to class, is supposed to be this very, you know, hierarchically ranked system. You know, maybe it's 4 levels, maybe it's other levels within the systems, and it's supposed to be closed. It's supposed to be endogamous. You're not supposed to be permitted. Once you're born into that, that's it. You don't move up and down. You stay there, and if you want to be anywhere, you marry within that caste group. Now remember, this is India. This is like 1 billion people, so you got plenty of choices within your caste. Don't worry. But you know, it is supposed to be this closed system. As several of you have pointed out, and the book points out, and Leah just said, officially, caste has not been permitted in India, I think since the independence since 1947, it's outlawed. But, you know, a lot of people still talk about it. I think, actually, Liz, what are you saying that Professor Sugandhi, when she would go into India, what people always want to know about her?
I think it said mostly women asked her what caste is.
Right, maybe trying to figure out like the maiden name and go and sort of the naming stuff.
She said mostly they asked what her mother's maiden name is.
What her mother's maiden name is. Okay, interesting. So it's this way of kind of figuring out, you know, what's happened where, you know, that's sort of a proxy for where you may have come from. So it's officially not permitted, but as the book says, you know, that this still seems to be an issue. And there's this great section about how they talk about higher education in class, and they suggest that exacerbates instead of ameliorates tensions of class and caste. So the idea is that, you know, if you go into higher education, if you go to college, you're supposed to get some sort of class social mobility, right? That's why we're here. But their idea is that in India, it exacerbates it. It can rev that up instead of toning it down. Now, what I guess to me, again, and this is why I'm so suspicious of necessarily saying that India is so different than us, is that if you substitute the word class in that whole passage and acted like it was the United States, you would not get anything different than what you get in India, which is to say that we actually are finding out that the higher education system in this country exacerbates rather than ameliorates social mobility. So I guess that my final thought on this is that a lot of people have wondered to the extent to which the United States, although we are officially a class society and we don't have anything to do with caste, if you combine social endogamy and marrying each other and being around each other and a hierarchy of education systems in which if you don't go to certain schools, you don't get to have any social mobility, people have speculated. We can throw in some race stuff there as well. Is the United States more of a caste society? And I don't mean we're importing all the terms from India, obviously not, but is it as possible to move from one class to another as we might imagine? And like I said, I would ask you to read that passage on page 120 about the educational system in India and just substitute in, just imagine that it's social class or social class and ethnicity, race in the United States and see what happens. And I think, you know, you'll find that maybe we aren't as different as we think we are. Now, this is a thinking exercise. I don't want to, there have been people who have said, oh yes, we do live in a caste society. I'm not making that claim. I'm just asking us to think a little bit about these things. And before we get all excited about the Indian caste system. But like I said, go to that thing on Thursday at 4 and see what they say. They know what they're talking about. All right, the other thing that we did not talk about yet, in part because we're going to spend a whole chapter on this later on, is social organization by gender. One of the things that I want to talk about here is that, I don't want to do that yet, is that in the 1970s, the feminists started looking back at those kinship charts that anthropologists had produced. And if you remember in the last class, we did one of those kinship charts and we talked about how, you know, the circles and the triangles and how there wasn't that much room for anyone else. And the 1970s feminists made an incredible contribution to this because they sort of went back to some of these old ideas and those old things that people had drawn up. And they started to ask a couple different questions. One is there a sort of universal cross-cultural male-female oppression? And so do we see this in all societies, or is it unique to some? Is it more or less? And then their other question is, of course, well, you know, is there any other way of organizing society? Are other things possible? I want to deal a little bit with the oppression thing. Michelle, you talked to about something that is an unpleasant thing to think about, but I'm glad you answered your own question. You were talking about female infanticide, right? What did you find?
That they regard it as a productive and efficient way to control starvation and force standards of living caused by overpopulation.
Yeah, I mean, it's nobody, nobody really wants to do female infanticide or even think about it. It usually comes up though in places in which the economic and social constraints are such that it has become either more valuable to have sons or simply untenable to have too many daughters. And so, I mean, your book briefly mentions this. We could spend a lot of time talking about where and when this actually happens. It's not something that usually people, it's not something that is systematic, but it does arise in certain situations. And so people would wonder, is this a sign of a universal female oppression? And I guess to answer that question, I would say simply that it is not. It arises in certain situations, but if you change the situations, then you might, then that goes away, or you might even have daughter preference. So, it's very important to understand that, but it is something that people wonder about if cross-culturally this has been a thing. And then there's the idea of, actually, I also wanted to mention, when we were doing the kinship charts, I kept saying, well, in today's world, we might not want to think about just circles and triangles. And I just wanted to point out that ideas about that people belong to something other than male or female are actually very deep in different communities and very widespread around the world. So on page 136 is an example of someone in Canela who was born as a man, developed shamanic abilities, and became a woman during old age. So the idea of these kinds of transitions between genders, of being maybe a third gender, what in some Native American societies are called two-spirit persons, or a fourth gender, are actually pretty prevalent, have gone back for hundreds of years. So when I said in today's world, I should also say that in the ancient world, in the old world, in the pre-colonial world, and around the world, these ideas are very widespread. But the other thing I want to talk about in this gender segment, and in part it has to do with the matrilineal part, is this really fascinating study that was done by Kai Hua on a society without fathers or husbands. I realize I think I'm going way back in the comment history, but Danielle, what did you notice about this society?
I thought, well, before when we talked about it, like when we talked about it,
Mm-hmm.
It was the matrilineal family,
Mm-hmm.
and I just thought it was funny how it was like the men had to leave at a certain time, like get you see what's coming out, however, something like that, and like if they saw a man at one's house, it was like something like, or it was like it was a funny situation because like you would never really see that in this society, and if you would see that, it would be like strange.
Yeah, I mean, I think this may be a fairly unique case. I mean, maybe it was true in other matrilineal societies, but as we talked about, it's a matrilineal society, so things are being inherited through the mother's line, names, land, all those things. And if that is true, then also the mother's brother is going to be the one who's kind of in charge of that. And Hua is saying that in this society, they would form, the women would have unions, maybe even long-term unions with men, but they'd have to leave in them at a certain time. They didn't care who the genetic parent was, the father was, and they were raised by their mothers and in their household. It was it was so different that I was like, wow, really? I mean, it was kind of mind-blowingly different. I guess that's the kind of stuff that we come to anthropology for, that it just seems so different that you're like, well, okay, there are other things that are possible. Maybe that seems a little extreme, but you know, it might make sense in what we might consider an extremely matrilineal society. You know, and the idea that the Na regard a vow of fidelity as shameful because it involves a negotiation or exchange which goes against their customs. Like, huh, all right, well, you know, that's different. And like some of you were commenting about the Maasai and how they didn't want people to fall in love because that might be harmful to the relationship that they were trying to cultivate there. So, you know, I mean, I think that sometimes we do go to these places that are way different in order to just ponder, you know, well, people can organize themselves differently. It takes some doing, but it is, you can see things at the glimpses of society. Huh, age. Another thing we didn't talk about the last time. And the two people who talked about it in the comments aren't here. Age. Huh. So this is another way that people have organized socially by age set or age grades. Some of you may remember, sometimes I've assigned to you a reading called Shakespeare in the Bush by Laura Bohannon, which goes through this story and you know, it's basically the story of Hamlet. And they say that, you know, Hamlet should never have tried to take things into his own hands because that was something that his father's age mates should have done. So the idea is that, you know, if you're in a certain age set, you have a certain amount of respect. And then they also talk about, it was funny, PowerPoint is doing this to me. They suggest little icons for me. So there, that's what they suggested. Do you think that icon is ageism? Does that look like it's discriminating against old people? Has anybody ever heard of ageism? What is ageism? We had two people sort of shaking their head. Jonathan, go ahead.
Discrimination on the basis of someone's age.
Discrimination on the basis of someone's age, yes. This often happens in the hiring process, right? Where, you know, it's like, you're too old and too slow to do that work. Can't work with those computers anymore. So it can happen in the hiring process. It can happen on the job. It can happen in different places. It's usually, I guess, phrased as something that happens to older people.
My mother works for AARP.
Uh-huh.
I've heard a lot about this.
You've heard a lot about this, a ton about this. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that that's one of their issues. Do you feel ageism as, my students, this has been a long time. I used to teach in Michigan, and they felt that the primary source of ageism was directed against them as young people, and they couldn't get service because people would just be mean to them because of their age. How are you feeling about that? Are you feeling ageism against you? Nuns? Yeah, in our society, we usually prioritize youth. We usually are happy about being young. So I guess we don't complain about that here. I think ageism has come out a lot in the last couple of years when we've talked about things we should do with regard to the coronavirus. And it's like, there have been a lot of people who are like, it's just the old people. Keep on keeping on, folks. We don't need to do anything. And so I think in our society, if we wanted to see examples of ageism, AARP, boy, oh boy, it got ramped up in the last couple years. It was like, why? We don't have to do anything. It's the olds, poor old people like me. Do you think this is If you saw something like this, is it implying wisdom and beauty or old and slow? Old and slow. Yeah, I don't even know what this means. Old people crossing the street here, I guess. I haven't seen this. I haven't, that only PowerPoint told me I should use it. Bad PowerPoint. All right. So that was where I hope to get by the end of, or I actually hope to get to this slide by the end of last Thursday. And here we are on Tuesday, and we're finally there to something that I want to talk about, which is this idea that kinship isn't as important in the West. That because of the role of government and the state expands, then kinship doesn't play such an important role. And this was, again, one of the guiding principles of some of those early anthropological studies. The idea was, okay, in this society, they don't have a state or a government, and so they organize themselves by kinship. But in our society, because we have the state and a government and a meritocracy, kinship doesn't matter that much anymore. And to that I say, what are you talking about? You know, I mean, if you think about our political system and the people who always seem to be occupying the top ranks, and why we have to deal with people with the same last names all the time, the idea that kinship has faded away from our society is kind of strange. And so we sometimes talk about this. So now I want to talk about the reasons why kinship returned as a study or as a part of anthropology. And one reason is simply that kinship hasn't at all, I mean, sure, maybe it's faded out in certain places, but as a general rule, it certainly has not disappeared. Now, we often do this when we look at different societies. Liz, you were looking at something that was happening in, I think, in the Middle East. What's happening there?
The Taliban took over.
They have
Is there?
they use the court system for local dispute, but sometimes that doesn't work, and they go back to their old school ways.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you look at pages 140 through 142, it talks about traditional kinship practices in the Middle East, that there's this legal system, but they still rely on kinship system, especially if that goes away. And there's some research that says, okay, well, there's been a lot of modernization, but kinship is still hugely important. And I guess I would also add to that, that this, again, remains true in the West and in our own society, that there's a lot of kinship stuff and a lot of cronyism and a lot of stuff going on that is also true in our own society. So I guess I would say, in general, the idea that as societies modernize, either in our own society or other societies, kinship will fade out has not come to pass. So that's one reason that kinship has remained or come back into as a category of anthropological analysis. The other thing that happened is that people started to think about how in other places, and perhaps in our own society, people's kinship relations extend beyond our typical idea of people as being kin only with human beings. So in our textbook, it talks about people who think about kinship as they use the example of the Caste in the Andes as the mountains as being part of their kinship system, as their grandfathers, so that you can have a relationship with the land around you. Oh yes, and that's good for Thursday's talk as well. You can also have kinship with plants, that they are considered to be part of your kinship system, or with non-human animals, briefly mentioned on page 137. And so in many societies, the idea of kinship extends outside of the human world. And again, that's led to some interesting anthropological reanalysis of what it means to have that kind of kinship. And I'm hoping, if for those of you who stay with me for the history of ethnographic thought next semester, we'll be doing a lot of this kind of stuff, of the relationship between humans and the non-human world like this. So we'll get some of that then. But I just want to mention that here as a reason that kinship has returned. Another reason that kinship has returned are all the funny things that we're doing with reproductive technologies, or taking sperm from one person and putting it into the egg of another person, and then having another person carry that egg, and then who is that person related to? Or if they all come from the same sperm donor, are those people related to each other? Should they all get together over the internet? So technologies have also called into question that, if kinship is simply this biological reality and what it means to be part of the biological reality. So these are all reasons why kinship has kind of come back and is hot again in anthropological thinking about social relations. The chapter also includes a whole bunch of stuff about objects and exchange, and using objects to do social relations. So we talk about, in anthropology, we talk about social relations as being these things that people use to classify, like kinship, social class, caste, all the things we just did, age, gender. But there's also this economic exchange aspect to things, which is that people also organize, or very importantly, organize their relationships through being able to trade things with different groups and within societies. And so in this last part of the chapter, the authors go through some of what we might call the classic anthropological studies on this, things that have been sort of hugely important for what's sometimes called economic anthropology. So they talk about different ways of gift giving and what we call reciprocity. And in many societies, what that means is when you give a gift to someone, you then have to give a gift back of equal or greater value at a later time. And so that becomes a way of sort of organizing the social life. And I wanted to note here, since we were just talking about these relationships of kinship beyond the human, that oftentimes people who live in societies, for example, in gathering and hunting societies, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, they have a relationship of reciprocity, not just among humans, but consider the relationship with the land, with the plants and animals to be one of giving and taking as well, and that you have to have a kind of permission to hunt or to gather in that area. So when we talk about reciprocity, that can be, we mostly think about people giving things and exchanging among human beings, but this can also be part of the world beyond the human as well. Like I said, they go through some of the huge anthropological examples that you could spend, whole class times talking about. The potlatch, which is a famous ceremony studied mostly by anthropologists, by Franz Boas in the Pacific Northwest, where you'd have these competitive feast or gift exchanges, which became so competitive and so kind of revved up that they were outlawed both in Canada and the United States, because people would, or the chiefs would sort of try to outcompete each other and end up destroying a bunch of blankets and wealth. So a huge anthropological literature on the potlatch. Another hugely famous case in anthropology, what Malinowski studied, and then perhaps what is the first ethnographic study we heard about Malinowski in the chapter on fieldwork methods. This interesting, what he called the Kula ring in the Trobriand Islands, where one way around the islands would circulate armbands and the other way would circulate these shells, and there'd be these multiple years of exchange that sort of cut across all these different social groups, and they'd sail across. Again, a really interesting anthropological system of what we might call competitive, not necessarily competitive giving, but you're always supposed to kind of be exchanging these objects around and acquiring fame in this way, and organizing your society. Again, on the theme of giving things beyond the human, they take it into something that we may know a little bit more about, which is the Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, primarily celebrated in Mexico, but really throughout Latin America and in the United States, where people give offerings to relatives and friends who have passed away. And there's again this idea of reciprocity, not just with the people who are living, but with people who are in the afterlife. So they give all these examples of what we might call traditional anthropological ways in which people exchange things outside of a system of what we consider to be the measure of exchange, which is I give you money and you give me something. So these are all ways in which we do a kind of gift giving or reciprocal exchanges that organize our society and resources, but are not necessarily involving money. And so at the end of the chapter, they then talk about the spread of capitalism, which again takes us back to the very beginning of the chapter, because that's what, of course, Marx and Engels were talking about. And on the issue of capitalism, I wanted to say a couple things going into this. I would say that they start their spread of capitalism a little bit late in the day, but you know, the point here, the key point, is that all societies around the world became involved in or affected by the start of a global transoceanic economy. That people started sailing around the world, displacing some people from their land, enslaving other people, mining silver, and creating these global trade routes, ramping them up, and in some ways making things exchangeable across different spheres that had not been brought into contact before. And so they talk about on page 148 the example of the TIV economy, which are described by, I mentioned Laura Bohannon. In this case, it was Laura Bohannon and Paul Bohannon and Laura Bohannon, who were married at the time, and talked about how among the TIV, they had these spheres of value where certain things could only be traded in their own way. And what capitalism does is it often cuts across those. So everything becomes valued in terms of money, and then you're able to make transactions which you may not have been able to make before. And so oftentimes this breaks through some of these traditional exchanges, because all of a sudden I don't want to trade my shell for an armband, because I can sell my shell for more money than you can give me an armband for. Now, that said, when we have the influence of capitalism and some of these outside monetary things coming in, it can result in people sort of bolstering what you might call their traditional values. And so when we think about the potlatch and why the potlatch was so huge and seemed to be so excessive and wasteful at the time that Boas was writing about it, part of it is because these groups were involved in the fur trade. And so they were getting a massive influx of alcohol, guns, blankets, in order to subsidize the furs that they were giving into the West. This was before people didn't like to wear fur. Everybody wanted to wear fur back then, and it was a huge economic incentive for people in these indigenous or Native American groups to hunt and trap. And so a lot of these things that were seen as traditional were actually being expanded by capitalism. And some of you in my class or other classes may have seen what is maybe the most famous anthropological movie of all time, Unca's Big Mocha, which is about this competitive feast giving ceremonies in Papua New Guinea. Again, seems to be exacerbated or revved up by the fact that Papua New Guinea was coming into and getting money from coffee trade and the influence of capitalist society. So what I'm trying to say here is that capitalism has this double edge that in some ways it breaks through and destroys certain traditional forms, but in other ways it can result in them revving up. It has certainly been, when we're thinking about how social relations are organized, the social relations that is the topic of this chapter, capitalism has been a huge force in moving people around and getting them into different places and in terms of their social class and importing people to do different things. Certainly we can't talk about social relations without capitalism. But it hasn't done what some people believed it was going to do, which is to make everybody the same. And so a lot of anthropologists in the early days, when they went out to study the Kula ring or went out to study the potlatch or went out to study Unca's Big Mocha, which is part of a film series called Disappearing World, the idea was, oh, all these traditional things are going away, they're disappearing because capitalism is taking over. And the next thing you know, we're all going to be Christians wearing suits and ties and doing our capitalist thing. Oddly, one of the reasons capitalism hasn't made everybody the same is because it's become a commodity now to sell different cultural items, to sell traditional stuff, to do tourism, to go to these places because people want to see different kinds of things. And so capitalism gets caught up in the manufacture of things that we might consider cultural or traditional. Now we can spend money for them and they can be commoditized. And it also, interestingly, as several of you talked about, I think Willa led off with it, and then Aaron commented, and then Lexi commented, you know, it's also led to this interesting commodification of you send me a swab of something and I'll tell you what your supposed ancestry is or your ethnicity is or who you're supposed to be related to. And we could talk about, you know, this gets really fuzzy once you go many generations back because our sample size is so big. But it is really interesting how much capitalism commoditizes those relationships and asks you to, you know, in part, spend money in order to find out your ethnicity. We were watching the World Cup a couple of years ago. That's when they had some of those 23andMe commercials. They wanted us to send in our swabs so we could figure out which World Cup team we should support based on our genetic ancestry. So, you know, I mean, that's some serious capitalist stuff going on to commoditize this idea of, you know, nationalism and ethnicity. And so it's probably no surprise that we have these ethno-nationalist leaders who are also trying to politicize that and to capitalize on the politicization of that. So again, it's just very important when we're thinking about these traditional anthropological studies and the ways in which people are different and have been able to organize themselves in different ways. And we get excited about the Na in China and how they're, you know, they're a society without fathers or husbands. We just need to keep in mind that all of these societies have been pulled into a global capitalist system. Like I said, that hasn't made everybody the same. And if you had told Franz Boas and other anthropologists 100 years ago that we would have on Thursday someone coming to Hartwick College that was going to talk about indigenous lands issues and how we might acknowledge our obligations to the Haudenosaunee, most people would have thought that this would have never happened, that there would never be anyone who identified as indigenous or Native American anymore, and that these issues would have gone away because everybody would have been subsumed into the capitalist system.